What if everything you believed about your family was a lie designed to break you? Madeline Whitman was cast aside, erased from her father's legacy, and left to disappear. But years later, with a new name and undeniable truth in her hands, she returns to the world that tried to destroy her. This isn't just a story about blood ties. It's a story about secrets, betrayal, and the silent fire of a woman who refuses to stay broken. When the masks fall and the truth hits the courtroom floor, will justice finally have a voice? They said I had every opportunity. What they didn't say was that I was never truly invited to the table. The Whitman estate in Highland Park had a kind of elegance that whispered power without ever needing to raise its voice. Gabled windows, manicured hedges, and a circular driveway that wrapped like a ribbon around a center fountain that hadn't worked since I was 9. It was a house full of portraits of achievement, curated like a museum of selective memory. At the end of the hall, just before the library, hung our family photo, taken during one of those stiff matching outfit Christmas sessions. It was meant to represent unity. But I remember that day vividly. My name was misspelled on the appointment sheet, and they nearly rescheduled because Ethan's sweater wasn't the right shade of navy. In the final framed version, I'm placed to the side, shoulder half cropped, as if whoever approved the print had been in on the joke. No one noticed. Or if they did, they said nothing. I was 17 the last time I truly tried to belong in that house. It was Ethan's celebratory dinner. Again. He had just been accepted early into Johns Hopkins pre-med, and the dining room was adorned with candles and congratulatory cards from everyone from our dentist to my father's golf partner. My mother was in rare form, fluttering from guest to guest with the grace of a hostess who knew exactly where her pride resided. I sat quietly at the long walnut table, wearing a pale blue dress that I thought made me look older, smarter. I had even styled my hair like one of the girls in the Atlantic's Young Innovators list, which I read obsessively in the school library between coding sessions. That morning, I had won first place in the state youth tech fair. My AI-based scheduling software beat out college entries. I had rehearsed how I would share it. But when my mother lifted her glass for the customary "let's each say one good thing about our day," I didn't even get the chance. Ethan's achievements poured out like a resume read aloud. Shadowed a cardiac surgeon, published a co-authored article in a minor medical journal, scored a 1580 on his SATs. Everyone clapped. When it was my turn, I said softly, "I presented my scheduling platform at the tech fair. We won first place statewide." There was a pause, like the silence that precedes a polite laugh at a joke no one understood. "That's nice, honey," my mother said with her familiar thin-lipped smile. "But are you still keeping up with debate club? Remember, colleges look for well-rounded applicants. My father didn't even look up." "What's your brother's GPA again, Ethan?" That night I sat at my desk with the soft glow of my monitor washing over the only space in the house that felt like mine. Code windows open, headphones in. My fingers moved like they were chasing freedom. I wasn't building for the competition anymore. I was building for myself. A vision was forming, fragmented, nameless, but pulsing with something alive. Next bridge started with a blank screen and a file saved as project_next_V1PYP. No one celebrated that moment. No one knew it existed but me. Downstairs, they toasted Ethan's future. Upstairs, I was writing mine. It wasn't that they hated me. Hatred requires attention, requires energy. No. What the Whitmans gave me was something colder, more refined. Strategic invisibility, and they wrapped it in compliments so faint they left no mark, like perfume that evaporated before you could name the scent. The next morning, the congratulations continued, not for me. Ethan received a leather-bound journal from my father. "To log your surgical journey," he said proudly, like he was handing down a sword. My mother brought out a cake topped with a miniature stethoscope and a fondant Dr. Whitman already inscribed. I stood in the kitchen archway, watching as she lit the candles, each one flickering like a decade of their ambition. I don't remember being invited to blow them out. The email from MIT came 2 days later. They'd seen my software demo through a tech blog and were offering a summer residency in Cambridge. Mentorship, a modest stipend, and access to research lab. It was everything I had quietly dreamed about for the past year. When I handed the letter to my mother in the kitchen, her reaction was clinical. "That's wonderful," she said without looking up from her tablet. "But you already registered for pre-law at Northwestern, didn't you?" "No," I said, pulse quickening. "I haven't committed. This is real, Mom. They picked me. Me." She looked up then, but not with wonder. Her brows furrowed. "Madeline, one-off opportunities like this are flattering but not strategic. Law school is long-term. These tech people, they bounce around. No stability, no structure. That's not what this family is about." I stood there holding the letter, ink still crisp, future still unfolding, and felt it begin to fold shut. Later that week, I found the MIT email printout torn and half-soaked in the recycling bin beneath the sink. The envelope had been addressed to me, but the handwriting on the back, not suitable, was hers. That's when I gulped, sharing. At school, I began to code in secret. I saved my work on encrypted drives, skipped debate club, and told my parents I was tutoring after hours. In truth, I was meeting Elena Morales at the public library, comparing scripts and solving bugs with the intensity of people twice our age. She was the only one who didn't raise her eyebrows when I explained my algorithmic decision tree. She just nodded and said, "Show me." Elena was bold in ways I wasn't yet. She wore bright lipstick to computer lab. She cursed at bad code. She talked about injustice in the healthcare system with the urgency of someone who had watched it destroy someone they loved. Her mother had spent 2 years misdiagnosed before finally getting proper lupus treatment, too late to reverse the organ damage. To Elena, technology wasn't abstract, it was salvation. So we started dreaming. What if we built something that could talk across hospital systems? What if we made medical records smarter, not just digital? What if no one else had to watch their mom fall through the cracks of broken communication? We stayed up nights sketching designs on napkins, logging ideas in a shared Google Doc labeled Operation Fix Everything. It was half joke, half prophecy. At school, I still wore the face they expected. Quiet, diligent, tolerable. But inside, I was fracturing into someone new. Someone building escape routes in code. Someone learning that power didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispered, "Wait." The night before graduation, my father called a family meeting to finalize Ethan's party guest list. My name was on the invite. Ethan Whitman and family, but not in bold. Never in bold. I sat through the discussion, nodding at catering options, the jazz quartet, the valet arrangements. When it was done, I excused myself, climbed the stairs to my room, and typed the final line of our back-end code for a system that would eventually power one of the most advanced health tech platforms in the country. I didn't need an invitation anymore. I was building the future, and they would only see it when it arrived, uninvited, at their door. You can't build an empire in silence, they say. But I did, because noise was never safe in that house. The first apartment Elena and I shared was a box with pipes that moaned in winter and a floor that always tilted slightly east. It sat above a shuttered laundromat in South Loop, where the train rumbled past every hour like a threat. Rent was cheap, dreams were expensive. We made it work. The window leaked cold in January, and the radiator hissed like it had opinions. But there was one desk, 2 laptops, and a mission. By then, we'd already filed for a provisional patent on our prototype, a modular platform that translated clinical data into human language notes doctors could actually use, messages patients could actually understand. We didn't have money, so we traded time, built WordPress sites for dentists, edited research presentations for nursing students, taught JavaScript to undergrads who barely showed up. Every dollar bought us server space. Every sleepless night, a little closer to launch. Elena's family brought us food. Her mother once showed up with a tray of empanadas and a look of fierce pride, like we were soldiers stationed on the front lines of something meaningful. When she asked what we were building, she didn't blink when we said, a communication layer for medicine. She only said, don't forget to rest. The world needs you healthy too. I didn't tell my parents where I lived. I let them believe I was still at Northwestern, maybe working part-time in an IT department, maybe just drifting. Every holiday dinner invitation came with a suggested outfit and a reminder to smile more. I declined most. The lie was easier when I wasn't in the room. But there were moments, quiet, dangerous moments, when I almost told the truth. When our first user pilot at St. Clara's Community Clinic went live, and a nurse cried because she could finally track dosage changes in real time. When Dr. Amelia Chen, a hospital administrator we met at a hackathon, called us the most important minds I've seen in a decade. When the back-end logs showed our system prevented a medication error in a patient with a seizure history, I wanted to shout it from rooftops, text it to my mother in all caps. Look, it's working. I matter. Instead, I saved the analytics to a folder named Proof, just in case. We didn't go viral. There were no splashy interviews, no think pieces in TechCrunch. What we had was slow traction, a quiet build-up, a dozen hospitals asking questions, a medical journal editor requesting a meeting, and then one day, a check arrived. $20,000. Our first prize grant from a social innovation competition we'd nearly missed the deadline for. We stared at the check for a full minute. Then Elena whispered, "We're real now." We took it to the bank like it was evidence of resurrection. We opened an LLC, bought better equipment, hired Tyler Terra, an engineering student with a genius for front-run UX and a knack for stress-baking cookies. NextBridge Technologies was born, quietly, like most revolutions, but I still hesitated to sign anything with my full name. When the article in MedTech Rising came out, a tiny blurb about a promising startup tackling communication breakdowns in medicine, the writer had asked for a founder photo. I sent one of Elena, smiling, against a whiteboard. Mine was a silhouette. Just M. Whitman. No email. No LinkedIn. "Why are you hiding?" Elena asked one night over instant ramen and code review. "The world should know who you are." I shrugged. The work matters more than his face. But in truth, I wasn't ready to be seen. Not by the world. And especially not by the people who taught me that being seen meant being judged, measured, found wanting. There's a particular freedom in anonymity, a sanctuary in silence. And for a while that silence felt like safety. Thanksgiving came early that year, not the holiday, just the conversation I dreaded. My father left a voicemail, crisp and impersonal as always. "Your mother and I would like to see you this week. Jason will be in town. Don't forget to bring something you're proud of to share." Something I'm proud of? I stared at my phone, the message still blinking. We'd just finalized a pilot with Mercy Central. Our largest client yet. The rollout went live that Monday. Nurses could finally update charts from tablets. Patients received alerts in plain English, not strings of diagnosis codes. One family even wrote us a letter. "This saved our dad's life," it said. But I didn't bring any of that. I brought a bottle of wine and a blouse plain enough to fade into wallpaper. The Whitman Thanksgiving was a polished affair. Linen napkins, food from a caterer who once served a U.S. senator, and a guest list so curated it felt like a board meeting. Jason's fiancée, a pharmaceutical sales rep named Sophia, was the newest addition. She had perfectly winged eyeliner and a firm handshake. My mother liked her immediately. We sat in the sunroom for pre-dinner cocktails. Jason recounted a complex case study from his hospital rotation. My father beamed. Elaine leaned in. "He's already being scouted for chief resident. Can you believe it?" I could. I believed it because it had been scripted since Jason was 10. "So, Madeline," Sophia turned to me, all warmth and curiosity, "what are you up to these days?" Before I could speak, my mother chimed in. "She's doing some kind of tech thing. You know how she is, always on the computer." Sophia smiled politely, but I saw it. The flicker of doubt, the coded language passed between women who've learned to read between lines. I murmured something vague. "Working on health systems." Jason sipped his drink. "Mom said you were between jobs." I blinked. "No, actually, I run a startup. We work with hospital networks to improve patient communication." Jason raised an eyebrow, amused. "Like an app?" The conversation moved on before I could reply. I sank into silence, tracing the condensation on my glass. Later, in the kitchen, my mother found me rinsing dishes. "Jason's friend Mark is single, you know," she said softly, "finishing neurology residency at Northwestern. Maybe I could introduce you." I stared at the faucet, the stream of water roaring in my ears. "I'm not looking for introductions, Mom." She gave that familiar half-laugh, the one that always sounded like it belonged to someone watching from a distance. "Well, you never know. Maybe he could help with your career transition." That night, back in the apartment, I opened the analytics dashboard for NextBridge. Our platform had logged over 8,000 active users in the past 24 hours. Error rates down, satisfaction scores up. Elena sent me a voice message from her parents' garage, where she was organizing our old sketches. I found the napkin with the first idea we ever wrote down. It's wild. We're actually doing it. And we were. Just no one in my family cared to ask how. I met with Dr. Camille Foster the next morning. She was the one person who knew everything, not because I told her in one sitting, but because she listened over time. She poured tea into chipped porcelain mugs that didn't match and said, "Let's start where it still hurts." So I told her about Thanksgiving. "How did it feel?" she asked. I stared at the steam rising from my cup, like I was playing the ghost of someone they once tried to love. Camille nodded, her tone gentle but firm. "There's a difference between invisibility and protection. Sometimes hiding is armor, but armor gets heavy." That night, I renamed our internal development folder, Whitman Protocol, Final Phase, because it was time to stop hiding. They didn't have to know I was building something world-changing. But when they found out, it would be too big to ignore. The first snowfall of the season came early to New Haven, draping the streets in silence. I arrived just past noon, rental car wheels crunching against the curb outside a modest Victorian house with faded shutters and a chipped mailbox that still read C. Whitman. No one had lived here since my mother died. She passed when I was 10. Car accident, they told me. A single crash on an icy road outside town. Closed casket. No goodbyes. Just Elaine's cold announcement over dinner 2 days later. "Your mother's gone. We'll all need to be strong now." I never knew where she was buried. Never asked. But this house, it was still in her name. I found out 3 months ago through a property search for a completely unrelated zoning case. Camille encouraged me to go. Closure, she called it. I didn't have a better word. All I knew was that something in me had started to itch, like a page had been dog-eared in a book I thought I'd finished long ago. The inside of the house smelled like time. Wood polish and dust. A forgotten life folded into corners. I moved through the rooms, slowly, my breath fogging in the chill air. No electricity, just winter light. In the upstairs closet of what used to be a study, I found a stack of boxes labeled in my mother's handwriting, receipts, medical statements, photos, and at the very bottom, a sealed manila envelope marked, "For Madeline, when she's ready." My heart stilled. I sat on the floor, my hands trembled. Inside the envelope, a birth certificate. Mine, but not the version I had grown up with. This one listed a different hospital, a different state, and under mother's name, Camille Whitman. Father's name, no entry, just a line. There was also a letter written in pen so familiar it made my throat tighten. "My dearest Madeline, if you're reading this, I'm no longer here, and I'm sorry for the world you grew up in. I had hoped to raise you differently, but I didn't get that chance. You may not remember everything. I fear they've tried to rewrite your truth. But you were born from love, not mistake. And the man they told you was your father, he isn't. You deserve to know the truth. I tried to fight them. They took everything. Start with the safe deposit box. Trust your instinct, not their voices. I love you. I never stopped. Mom, I read it again and again. By the time the sun dipped below the line of rooftops, I hadn't moved. My life had gone numb, but I barely noticed. My life, my name, my memories, my family had all been doctored. It was never just that Elaine disliked me. It wasn't just that Dad barely looked me in the eye. It was that I didn't fit the mold because I was never meant to be part of it. They didn't raise me out of love. They kept me out of possession, out of guilt or control. I stared at my reflection in the dusty glass pane, my mother's cheekbones, my hairline, not Elaine's. For the first time in years, I said the name aloud, "Camille," and my voice broke on the sound. The next morning, I drove straight to Brookhaven Trust and Federal, the name scribbled on the back of the envelope. The building was sandwiched between a law office and an old diner on Maple Street, the kind of place where time moved slowly and everyone remembered your order from 10 years ago. Inside, everything smelled like carpet cleaner and brass polish. I approached the front desk, clutching the letter and my mother's death certificate. "I'd like to access a safe deposit box," I said. "It's under the name Camille Whitman. I have the key." The clerk glanced up, eyebrows lifting just slightly. "Relation?" "Daughter." He didn't ask more, just nodded, typed something into the terminal, and led me down a narrow hallway lined with numbered metal drawers. My key fit into box 218A. When the lock clicked open, I paused. My fingers hovered over the handle, breath caught in my throat. Inside was a small stack of neatly arranged documents, a velvet pouch, and an old cassette tape wrapped in a tissue-thin sheet of notepaper. "Play me When You're Alone." I tucked the tape into my coat pocket and focused on the papers. The first was a notarized letter from a law firm, Samuels and Trent, Family Law, Manhattan. It detailed a custody battle, filed by Camille Whitman, dated July 1997, petitioning the court for full custody of her daughter Madeline Whitman, from one Elaine Harper, who had, according to the document, wrongfully assumed guardianship under false pretenses, following the sudden incapacitation of Ms. Whitman due to alleged medical malpractice. It was never an accident. She hadn't just died, she was silenced. The second was a DNA report, heavily redacted but conclusive enough to scream the truth. I was not biologically related to Richard Whitman. The man I called Dad for 27 years was never in the equation. The velvet pouch contained a small silver locket. Inside, a photo of a man with dark, thoughtful eyes. He looked like me. No name, no dates, just a puzzle missing all but one piece. Back in the rental car, I sat parked in a back alley behind a laundromat and slipped the cassette into the old Walkman I'd picked up at a thrift store on the way in. A woman's voice, faint but clear, filled the silence. "Madeline, it's me, if you're listening. I didn't get to finish everything I wanted to tell you. They came for me faster than I expected. Elaine, her husband. They took you in while I was still under sedation. I woke up and you were gone." My fingers curled into a fist. I tried, I fought, but they were wealthier, louder, better connected, and they made me look insane. I was grieving your father's death, and they used it to paint me as unfit. You were my world, Maddie." She choked on the last word. I bit down hard on my tongue. "I want you to know that you were always loved, even when they told you otherwise, even when they made you feel like you didn't belong. Because you didn't. They never meant to love you. They meant to control the narrative, to erase me from it. But you're stronger than them. You always were." The tape ended in static. I sat there for a long time, the hum of the laundromat vents rattling overhead. My hands had stopped trembling. My body was still, cold with realization. Everything had been stolen from me. Not just a childhood, but a mother, a name, a truth. But not anymore. I opened my phone and texted Camille. "It's time. They lied about everything. I'm going back." A few seconds later, 3 dots pulsed on screen, then her reply. "I've been waiting. Let's burn the house down." Metaphorically, of course. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the old pain make room for something new. Resolve. The hostess at the Maple Room, a polished brunch spot nestled between boutique galleries in Highland Park, smiled politely as she led me to the private table on the terrace. A linen canopy flapped gently in the early April breeze. The glassware shimmered, so did the tension. Elaine was already seated, dressed in her signature pale blue blazer, one manicured hand cupping a mimosa. Across from her, Richard looked older than I remembered. More silver in his temples, but the same air of curated authority. Camille sat at the edge of the group, legs crossed tightly, her expression unreadable behind oversized sunglasses. "You're late," Elaine said without looking up. I set my clutch on the table, pulled out a chair, and smiled. "Fashionably. You did always say I lacked presence." No one laughed. Richard gave me a once-over, brow arched. "You've changed?" "You haven't," I said, lifting my water glass, still pretending I don't know what you've done. Camille coughed, the kind that was more signal than symptom. Elaine leaned forward slightly, her voice low. "We agreed to keep this civil." "Of course," I nodded. "Let's be civil. Let's talk about brunch and betrayal over eggs Benedict." Silence stretched thin across the table. The waiter arrived and Elaine quickly ordered for the table. I declined. My stomach was a knot, but asked for black coffee. As the waiter left, Richard steepled his fingers. "You asked for this meeting, Madeline. What do you want?" I studied him, the man I once called father, who'd watched my mother be erased and said nothing. "Closure. Or revenge. Depends on the hour." Camille shifted in her seat. Elaine's mouth twitched. "You've built quite the fantasy," Richard said, his voice calm. "Your mother was mentally unstable. We did what was necessary to protect you." I pulled out the copy of the custody documents from my bag and placed them gently between the salt and pepper shakers. "Funny," I said, "because according to these, you stole me while she was under medical sedation. You did emergency guardianship under perjury. You forged her psychiatric evaluation." Elaine's eyes flashed. "Where did you get that?" "She left a trail. One you never thought I'd be smart enough or brave enough to follow." Camille finally spoke. "She's bluffing." I turned to her. "Then sue me, but if you do, I'll subpoena the hospital, the family law court, and your emails from 1997 through 2001. And let's not forget the tape. I'm sure a jury would love to hear my mother's last words." Elaine stood abruptly, chairs scraping loudly against the wood. "This is ridiculous." "Sit down," Richard muttered through clenched teeth. "She's not bluffing." For the first time I saw something shift in him. Not fear exactly, but calculation. The realization that this wasn't a child's tantrum, it was a woman's reckoning. I leaned forward, elbows on the table, calm as lake water before a storm. "I don't want your apology. I don't want your money. I want your silence," Elaine hissed. "You think we'll just disappear?" "No," I said quietly. "I think you'll wish you had." I took a long sip of coffee. Bitter. Perfect. The wind picked up, scattering a napkin across the floor. None of us moved. I stood. "You once told me I'd never be more than an accessory to the Whitman name," I said. "Turns out, I'm the headline. Enjoy the show." And with that, I walked out of the maple room and back into the world. Not as their daughter, not as their pawn, but as a woman armed with truth, and I was just getting started. That night, I didn't go home. I drove straight to a small office building off Elm Street in Lakewood, tucked between a chiropractor's clinic and a bakery that always smelled like burnt cinnamon. The brass nameplate on the door read, "Garrison and Bloom, Estate and Family Law." Inside, the lights were still on. "You're early," said Naomi Garrison, sliding a thick folder across the glass table. "Brunch ran short," I replied. She smiled without warmth. "I take it they didn't deny the documents?" "They denied everything else," I said, thumbing through the papers. "But not the truth. They know I'm not bluffing." Naomi leaned back in her chair. "Then we're where we need to be." 3 weeks ago, I'd walked into her office with little more than a voice memo from my late mother and a tattered shoebox of old legal mail. Now, I had a case file thick enough to frighten a politician. Forgery, coercion, breach of fiduciary duty, medical malpractice, even evidence tampering. Naomi said it was like someone baked a scandal pie and served it at a charity luncheon. I didn't want revenge to feel good. I wanted it to feel righteous. That weekend, I met with Peter. He'd been my mother's financial advisor before he mysteriously resigned in 2002. Now he ran a modest real estate firm in Denton and lived with his husband and 3 dogs. When I first called, he hung up. When I showed up at his office in person, he stared at me like he'd seen a ghost. "Madeline Whitman?" he asked, visibly pale. "No," I said. "Madeline Mitchell." "My mother was Olivia. You remember her?" He did. And once the fear wore off, he opened a cabinet and pulled out a fireproof safe. Inside was a folder labeled Olivia Mitchell, Confidential, 1999. He handed it to me, slowly, as if it were an unexploded bomb. I'd been waiting 20 years to give this to someone. Inside were bank statements, notarized letters, and an unsigned copy of a second will that Richard had buried, one in which Olivia left full custody of me to her sister in Oregon. There was also a photograph, my mother in a hospital bed holding a newborn. Me. A nurse in the background looked oddly familiar. Peter confirmed it. The nurse was Elaine. The pieces were falling into place faster now. Naomi moved to petition the court to reopen the guardianship records. Peter agreed to give a sworn deposition, and I, for the first time in decades, felt the edge of the truth press sharp against the surface of my skin. But this wasn't just about what they'd done to my mother. It was about what they'd done to me. They took my name, rewrote my story, and locked me inside their version of it. I drove back to the apartment just past midnight. The Dallas skyline shimmered in the distance, its lights indifferent to the war I was waging. My voicemail pinged. 4 new messages. Camille, Elaine, Camille again, Richard. I didn't listen. I forwarded to Naomi, let her team catalog every desperate word. Instead, I opened my laptop, pulled up the burner email I'd created months ago, to claire.barnes@dallasmirror.com, subject R.E. Mitchell Custody Files Attachment, Custody Fraud Message. Claire, you were right to be curious. Attached are court-sealed documents proving everything I claimed, and more. My name is Madeline Mitchell. I'm ready to talk. Let me know when you are. I hit send. Outside, a siren wailed somewhere far off. A train horn echoed in the night. I didn't flinch, because this wasn't the end. It was the broadcast, and the world was finally tuning in. I didn't sleep the night the story went live. At 5:14 a.m., the Dallas Mirror dropped the headline like a guillotine. Heiress erased, the Olivia Mitchell custody scandal. Beneath it, a photo of my mother in a hospital gown holding me, the nurse, Elaine, clearly visible in the corner. By 7 a.m., the story had been syndicated. By 9, it was trending on Twitter. Hashtags bloomed like bruises. Stolen daughter, Whitman cover-up, justice for Olivia. My inbox drowned in interview requests. Old college classmates I hadn't spoken to in a decade sent stunned messages. Even my landlord left a sticky note on my door. Saw the article, if you ever need help with rent, don't hesitate. For the first time in my life, the silence surrounding my past broke like a dam. But the real storm was just beginning. By noon, Richard issued a statement through his law firm. The allegations made by Miss Mitchell are categorically false, malicious, and intended to damage our family's reputation. We will pursue all legal remedies. A picture of him in his gray three-piece suit accompanied the press release, standing next to Camille, who looked like she'd aged 10 years overnight. But I wasn't afraid of their denial. I'd expected it. What I wasn't prepared for was the letter. It arrived by courier at 3:17 p.m., hand-delivered to my apartment with a smile and a clipboard. White envelope, heavy stock, no return address. My name, Madeline Mitchell Whitman, written in bold cursive ink. Inside was a copy of the Whitman Family Trust Agreement, page flagged in red. Section 8.3, the Bloodline Clause. No individual shall inherit any part of the estate if born of illegitimate relation or adopted in secrecy and withheld from the family register, unless acknowledged in writing by the family patriarch. My heart stopped. They weren't just planning to discredit me. They were going to erase me again, this time from the legal records. I took the document straight to Naomi. She read it in silence, her expression tightening like a screw. Then she muttered, "They're going to claim you're not of blood, that your mother lied about paternity." "They can't," I whispered. "They will." I thought of the nurse, Elaine, slipping into that hospital room, the missing birth certificate. The way Camille always called me her husband's burden. Everything clicked. "Naomi," I said, my voice shaking, "we need a DNA test, a court-ordered one. Now." She nodded. "I'll draft the motion, but you need to understand, if they're going this far, they're scared." That night, I stood in front of the mirror, holding the envelope in both hands. I looked like my mother. Same eyes, same stubborn chin, same capacity for pain. But now, I had something more. I had proof, I had power, and tomorrow I was walking into the lion's den with both. Not for redemption, for reckoning. The conference room on the 19th floor of Whitman & Steele LLP smelled like varnished oak and denial. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in the same black pantsuit I wore to my first job interview. Sharp lines, unflinching posture. Naomi followed behind me, armed with a file folder thick with affidavits, notarized statements, and the pièce de résistance, the DNA report. It was no longer a question of if I belonged. Science had answered that definitively. 99.97% paternal match, Richard Whitman. They couldn't deny blood anymore, but I knew Camille. She would find another way. The door opened. Richard entered first, flanked by two lawyers. Old, male, pale, and smug. He avoided eye contact, his mouth pinched in permanent disapproval. Camille came next, draped in navy silk, a diamond pin in the shape of a fleur-de-lis on her collar. She looked directly at me and smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Madeline, or is it still Olivia this week?" I didn't flinch. "You can call me whatever you like. The courts will call me your husband's daughter." One of the lawyers cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" Naomi leaned forward. Before we talk settlements or non-disclosures, my client has a statement to read into the record. I opened the folder. To the parties present and any legal representatives thereof, I said, my voice steady despite the thundering in my chest. I hereby present Exhibit A certified DNA test confirming biological parentage between myself and Richard Whitman. I also submit the original birth certificate, issued in Austin General Hospital in 1989, previously sealed due to private adoption protocols, now unsealed by court order. Richard stiffened. Camille blinked too quickly. I was taken from my mother without her consent, raised by strangers for a sum of money, then returned to you under the guise of pity, only to be erased again when your narrative no longer suited you. That ends today. I slid the report across the table. Richard reached for it slowly. His fingers trembled. Camille didn't look. Her attention was fixed on me. I should have let you rot in that shelter, she hissed, barely audible. I leaned in. You tried, but I learned how to survive rot. Naomi placed her hand on my arm, a subtle cue to rein it in. Here's what happens next, she said, smoothly taking the floor. We will be filing a formal motion to contest the bloodline clause along with a public defamation suit should any further statements be released disparaging Miss Whitman's legitimacy. We also request a full audit of the trust, I added, especially the discretionary disbursements between 2011 and 2016. The years you claimed the trust couldn't support my college tuition. Camille's composure cracked. You little... Say it, I challenged. Say what you've wanted to all these years. She stood abruptly, knocking her chair back. This was never about truth. It's about revenge. I stood too, taller than I felt. No, I said, it's about justice, and I finally have the language and the leverage to speak it fluently. Richard remained seated, face pale, report in hand. For a moment he looked small, not the powerful CEO, just an old man who could no longer outrun the truth. Richard, I said softly, you don't have to follow her down with this ship. But he didn't reply. As we left the room, Naomi whispered, You did good. I didn't feel triumphant, not yet. This wasn't the victory. This was the warning shot. And next time, I wouldn't be coming to negotiate. I'd be coming to end it. The chandelier in the ballroom of the Crestmore Hotel sparkled like nothing bad had ever happened beneath it. Waiters glided through the crowd with trays of champagne, while a string quartet played something elegant and forgettable near the marble fireplace. It was the kind of night Richard Whitman would have engineered to perfection, glamour, optics, control. But tonight none of it belonged to him. I walked in without fanfare. No red carpet, no security detail. Just a velvet green dress that once belonged to my mother, and a clutch that held every piece of truth this family had tried to bury. Naomi trailed behind me, scanning the crowd like a hawk. She knew tonight wasn't just social, it was surgical. At the far end of the ballroom, under a massive floral arch, stood Amelia. Sweet, golden Amelia, draped in white chiffon and innocence. She was laughing with guests, her engagement ring flashing like a mirror in the light. She didn't see me yet. Camille did. She froze mid-sentence when our eyes met. The color drained from her face in a way that no cosmetic surgeon could ever fix. Richard was beside her, flanked by Amelia's fiancé's parents, doing what he did best, playing the role of patriarchal monarch, untouchable and untarnished. Until now. Madeline? Naomi whispered. You're sure? I gave the smallest nod. Press record. We moved toward the stage. Each step was heavy with memory. The day they told me I'd never be good enough. The night I overheard Richard rewrite my mother's story into a scandal. The birthdays unacknowledged. The letters returned, unopened. Tonight, I wasn't seeking closure. I was delivering consequences. Amelia spotted me as I reached the steps. Her eyes widened with confusion, then panic as Camille hissed something in her ear. But it was too late. I stepped up and tapped the microphone. A sharp feedback noise cut through the music and chatter. "Good evening," I said, calm as glass. "My name is Madeline Whitman. I wasn't on the guest list, but I believe I'm overdue for an introduction." The room stilled. Some people squinted, trying to place me, already knew, and began whispering. Richard stood frozen. Camille's hand tightened around his arm. "I'm here because this family has profited off lies for too long. Lies about blood, inheritance, and abandonment. I was born Olivia Mitchell. I was raised in foster care after being taken from my mother, under the pretense of a closed adoption. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a large envelope. In this envelope are notarized records, including a DNA report confirming Richard Whitman as my biological father. Also included are bank records, showing hush payments routed through a shell foundation to avoid scrutiny during his Senate campaign. A gasp rippled through the room. Amelia's fiancé looked between her and Camille, visibly disturbed. Tonight was supposed to be about love and family. So let's talk about family, the one I was denied, the one my mother was paid to forget, the one that let me grow up with nothing while they sipped champagne. I turned to Richard. "You looked me in the eye last month and said you needed time. This was what you needed time to do? Dress up the lie one last time before the whole thing collapses?" He didn't speak. He couldn't. Camille tried. "She's mentally unstable. She has a history of drug." "False," Naomi cut in, projecting her voice like a lawyer born in fire. "All accusations Camille Whitman just made have been refuted by court-sealed records and are grounds for slander if repeated." I held up a photo. My mother, younger than I'd ever seen her, holding a newborn baby in a hospital bed. "That's the woman you erased." I turned back to the guests. "And that's the legacy I'm here to restore." The silence was no longer polite. It was seismic, tectonic, and it was about to crack. Gasps swelled like a wave as Gregory Whitmore emerged from behind the curtain. He was older now, stooped, silver-haired, but his eyes still burned with the same ruthless clarity that once made him Richard Whitman's most feared fixer. He stepped up beside me, facing the crowd with a leather folder clutched in one hand. "I served as Richard's personal counsel for over a decade," Gregory said, voice firm but calm, "until I walked away, after I was asked to bury something I refused to unsee." He opened the folder, revealing a stack of legal documents. "What I hold here," he continued, "are sealed transcripts from a suppressed custody hearing in 1994. In it, Camille Prescott testified that Olivia Mitchell's baby was a problem to be erased during Richard's re-election bid. Under oath, she admitted to funneling money through Draymond and Langley to pay off hospital staff and arrange an illegal private placement, effectively trafficking a child away from her biological mother. The room was frozen in horror. Richard tried to interrupt, but Gregory's voice cut sharper. "You lied to the state, to the press, and to your own blood." He handed me the folder, and I took it slowly, like lifting a torch that had waited too long to burn. "I wanted peace," I said, turning to face the Whitman family. "I gave you every chance, every quiet out, but you mistook silence for surrender." Amelia looked at me, tears brimming in her eyes. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I believe you," I replied. "But this isn't just about who knew and who didn't. It's about who benefited while pretending they didn't." Across the room, whispers turned into buzzing murmurs as guests started walking out. Investors, board members, reporters. The Whitman name was radioactive now, and everyone knew it. Naomi handed me a flash drive. "This," she said, addressing the crowd, "contains audio recordings of Camille's calls from last fall, discussing how to block Madeline's reappearance, how to frame her, how to keep Richard's image preserved until the grave. We've submitted them to the U.S. Attorney's Office." Camille paled and staggered back into a chair. Richard stayed standing, jaw clenched, sweat forming at his temples. He looked less like a mogul now and more like a man who just realized legacy means nothing when your children see you as a fraud. I turned to the press, because they were here now, cameras up, phones rolling. "You want a quote?" I asked. "Here it is. Blood may be thicker than water, but truth cuts deeper. My name is Madeline Whitman, and this family no longer defines me." I stepped down from the stage, the room parting in stunned silence. Outside, the chill of early spring kissed my skin, grounding me. The sun had set, but for the first time I felt lit from within. Naomi joined me, slipping her hand into mine. "What now?" she asked. I looked at the black town car parked across the street. A man in a trench coat stood beside it, holding a small case. He nodded at me, then at Naomi. "That's Paul from the attorney's office. He's taking everything you gave him. They're filing charges against Camille and Richard by morning." I exhaled, not relief, something more sacred, liberation. Back in my apartment that night, I opened the old photo box one last time. My mother's face smiled up at me from a Polaroid, young, unprotected, hopeful. I whispered, "I did it, Mom. I brought it all into the light." And in that silence, I finally felt her with me, not as a memory but as a presence, as strength. This wasn't just revenge, it was reclamation. The past had tried to bury me, but I had become the storm that unearthed it, and I was just getting started. Thank you for walking this path with me. Madeline's story is not just about betrayal or revenge. It's about breaking the silence, reclaiming truth, and finding the courage to stand alone if necessary for what is right. She was never just a daughter lost in the shadows of a powerful family. She became the storm they never saw coming. To everyone who has ever been silenced, dismissed, or pushed aside by the very people meant to love them, this story is for you. And to those rebuilding their lives from broken trust, know this: your truth matters, your voice has power, and sometimes healing begins not with forgiveness, but with freedom. If Madeline could speak to us now, she'd say, "You don't have to carry the weight they left on your shoulders. You are allowed to let go and rise." Until next time, take care of your story, because someone, somewhere, needs to hear it.